Ah, hello, dear friends, and welcome back to this, the seventh part of a whispered read-through of the 70 Great Mysteries of the Ancient World, unlocking the secrets of past civilizations. An incredible book that details the mysteries, myths, and legends of ancient societies and compares the archaeological and historical evidence for their reality. So we have here at 31 a interesting topical question actually. Were the ancient Egyptians black Africans? So this is a big topic at the moment. At the time of recording, of course, Netflix has just produced and aired a documentary about Cleopatra being black, the evidence for it, and that has led to a lot of discussion in global communities. So this is a very interesting question to start this section off with. 3100 to 332 BC in Egypt. Emil Amelinu in 1899. From various Egyptian legends, I have been able to conclude that the population settled in the Nile Valley were Negroes, since the goddess Isis was said to have been a reddish-black woman. So since Egypt's undoubtedly part of Africa, its inhabitants, both ancient and modern, are in a strict geographical sense certainly African. The question of whether the ancient Egyptians were black, however, is a much more complicated issue. To many modern writers, particularly those Afrocentrists who want to define Egypt as a purely black African civilization, the geographical location of Egypt is sufficient proof that its people were fundamentally black. But if we were attempting to answer the question properly, we need to define not only what the word black means now, but also what it may have meant in ancient times. So what do we mean by black? So unfortunately, even a cursory examination of modern writing on the subject reveals that the use of the term black as a means of categorizing groups or individuals differs largely according to the views of the individual writer. That's understandable. So sometimes this word is used to refer to the classic physical type, but very often it's a much vaguer sense, roughly equivalent to African, non-European. In contrast, perhaps surprisingly, there appears to be far more consensus and clarity in the ancient sources. Three main types of evidence from the ancient world tend to be used. So the skeletal remains from Egypt and adjoining regions, the texts and depictions of the ancient Egyptians, and the texts written by classical authors. So here we have two dynasty reserve heads from private tombs at Giza. One shows the more typical Egyptian physical features, while the other female has features that we typically associate with features of those who are black. Here are two troops of model soldiers from the tomb of Meseti. One shows Egyptian soldiers with reddish-brown skin, and the other are Nubian mercenaries with much darker skin. And here's the handle of a ceremonial cane of Tutankhamun, with figures of an Asiatic and an African. So, for instance, the British Egyptologist Brian Emery claimed on the basis of skull measurements that the late pre-dynastic Egyptians were conquered by a new race from the east, while Flinders Petrie at one stage suggested on similar grounds that the pyramid builders of the Old Kingdom were a group of non-Negroid invaders from Asia. However, as the methodology of biological anthropologists improved, simplistic assertions have become less common, and it's now widely recognized that the slippery idea of racial types cannot be readily assessed purely on the basis of skeletal remains. So although the history of anthropological influences on Egyptological historians periodically focused on possible confrontations between different groups, there's been certain amounts of continuity in the study of Egyptian human remains. And at the end of the 18th century, the pioneering anthropologist anthropologist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach reached the conclusion that there were three basic physical types among the Egyptians: Ethiopian, approaching to the Hindu, and a mixture of Ethiopian and Hindu. It was partly thought that the influence of Blumenbach's work that many anthropologists in the 19th century continued to stress potential racial connections between Egypt and southern Asia. In the earlier 20th century, several anthropologists used the so-called coefficient of racial likeness based on cranial measurements, claiming to provide hard scientific evidence for such a link between the Egyptian and South Asian physical types. Although the statistical validity of this coefficient has since been discredited, analyses of the Egyptian skeletal material undertaken during the 1990s suggest that the people of ancient Europe had stronger links with the people of Europe and South Asia than with the occupants of sub-Saharan Africa. And in addition, the most recent anthropological work suggests that the gradual north-south change in the Egyptian physical type isn't even an indication of mixing two distinct races, such as Negroid and Caucasoid, but a kind of spectrum or cline, whereby the physical type gradually adapts to environmental changes according to latitude and local conditions. The American anthropologist C. Loring Brace therefore concludes that attempts to force the Egyptians into either a black or white category have no biological justification. The old-fashioned chimerical concept of race is hopelessly inadequate to deal with the human biological reality of Egypt, both modern and ancient. So how did Egyptians view themselves? We can answer that first by looking at the way that they portrayed themselves in paintings and sculptures, but also analysing their depiction of foreigners. As in many other cultures, the Egyptians seem to have gained a sense of their own identity by contrasting themselves with the peoples of the world outside Egypt. The iconography of the Egyptians' depictions of themselves and foreigners suggests that for most of their history they saw themselves as a midway between the black, woolly-haired Africans and the pale, bearded Asiatics. The tombs of the New Kingdom pharaohs Seti I and Ramses III in the Valley of the Kings indicate scenes specifically depicting figures representing the various human types in the universe over which the sun god Re presided. They included reddish-brown Egyptians whose skin colour contrasts equally starkly both with the black-skinned Kushites, the Nubians, and with the paler-skinned Libyans and Asiatics. Although partly based on skin colour and other physical characteristics, these ancient ethnic types were also based on varieties in hairstyle and costume, the function clearly made to allow Egyptians to define themselves as a national group relative to the world. But Egyptians themselves would have recognised these as simplified stereotypes, given that thousands of portrayals of individual Egyptians on the walls of tombs and temples show that the population as a whole ranged across a wide spectrum. So black people in the classical world, as far as Greek and Roman writers were concerned, the most common yardstick of blackness was Ethiopia. The Ethiopians literally are constantly described as the blackest of all Africans known to the classical world, and it's significant that they're rarely confused with the Egyptians in the writings of authors such as Aristotle, Xenophanes and Ptolemy. But indeed Manilius in his Astronomica specifically lists a number of people in order of decreasing blackness: Ethiopians, Indians, Egyptians and Moors, while Strabo indicates that Ethiopians were like southern Indians and Egyptians were like northern Indians. It's also evident that the Greeks and Romans didn't tend to describe skin colour or other racial racial characteristics in pejorative ways. Instead, geographical methods of categorising people were much more important. So carefully selected quotations from classical authors, often cited totally out of context, have repeatedly been used by modern authors with access to grind on the subject. So, who were they? Ancient Egyptians. A number of facts can be determined with some confidence on the basis of the evidence currently available to us. First, as stated at the outset, Egypt is undoubtedly part of the African continent, though it's worth pointing out that it was also the African country best positioned to establish close contacts with the Near East and Mediterranean. Secondly, the language spoken by the Egyptians seems to have been primarily African in origin, but increasingly influenced by Semitic tongues, especially from the New Kingdom onwards. Thirdly, as far as their physical appearance was concerned, the overwhelming weight of evidence of ancient Egyptian classical art and literature indicates that the population of the Lower Nile Valley was racially and ethnically mixed, ranging from fully Negroid individuals into the south to paler-skinned, straight-haired Africa, Asia, and North Mediterranean. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the concept of a black people is a modern construct that only confuses the situation when attempts are made to apply to ancient contexts, just as there's never been any serious white Anglo-Saxon Protestant plot to define Egypt as a white civilization. There are no scientific grounds for describing it as a black civilization. The ancient Egyptians themselves wouldn't have understood the modern racial concept of blackness, and they clearly never defined their Egyptianness in purely racial terms. The culture and the archaeological record of ancient Egypt were the product of the interaction of many racial groups. In other words, the Egyptians were not quintessentially black, brown or white. They were simply Egyptian. Well, there you have it, folks. A little exploration of the subject there. Shall we tell Netflix? How did they erect pyramids and obelisks? 2551 BC to 100 AD. Here's Herodotus telling us that the pyramid was built in tiers, battlement-wise as it is called, or according to others, step-wise. When the pyramid was completed in this form, they raised the remaining stones to their places by means of machines formed of short beams of wood. So at least since the time of Herodotus, there has been considerable debate concerning the means that they used to construct it. The History Channel might say it's aliens, but very few Egyptian textual records referring to such methods survived, leaving experimental archaeology as the principal means of testing the various theories. So how did they align them so accurately? So in 1882, Flinders Petrie, the unquestioned father of modern archaeology in Egypt, undertook meticulous survey work on the Giza Plateau, site of the pyramid complexes of the 4th dynasty rulers Khufu, Khafre and Menkaure at the mid-3rd millennium BC. So the findings suggested that the area was carefully levelled, probably by cutting a series of trenches as a grid and flooding them with water, then reducing the surrounding stone islands to the desired level. And a century later, the American Egyptologist Mark Lehner carefully mapped and studied the various holes and trenches cut into the bedrock around the Giza pyramids, and that led them to suggest that the process of fine levelling took place not over the whole area, but simply along the narrow perimeter strips around the edges of the pyramid on which the lowest cores of casing would be placed. The Giza pyramids each contained a core massif of bedrock, and these cores of natural rock would have also prevented the pyramid builders from measuring diagonals to achieve a perfect square. And judging from surviving tools, Egyptian architects, surveyors and builders used two particular implements, the merket and the bay, which allows them to lay out straight lines and right angles, as well as orientating their sides and corners of structures in accordance with astronomical alignments. Here's a diagram of an early stage of pyramid construction, and here is a model of a wooden cradle or a rocker. So that could have been used to help move the pyramid blocks, although no full-scale examples have survived. Here we have the 5th dynasty pyramids at Abusir, with their 4th dynasty predecessors at Giza visible in the background. So although the outer casing of fine limestone was removed in ancient times, the core blocks of these pyramids have survived. And here are two of the 3 18th dynasty obelisks still standing in their original location in the Temple of Amun at Karnak. Really stood the test of time, haven't they? So the British Egyptologist I.E.S. Edwards argued that the true north was probably found by measuring the place where a particular star rose and fell in the west and east, then bisecting the angle between those 2 points. And then more recently, Kate Spence put forward a convincing theory that the architects of the Great Pyramid sighted on 2 stars rotating around the position of the North Pole, which would have been in perfect alignment around 2467 BC, when Khufu's pyramid is thought to have been constructed. This hypothesis is bolstered by the fact that inaccuracies in the orientations of earlier and later pyramids can be closely correlated with the degree to which the alignment deviates from true north. So the surviving evidence, especially from unfinished pyramids at such sites such as Saqqara and Giza, suggests at least 5 different systems of ramps might have been used to convey the blocks up to their final positions. The easiest and most obvious method would have been the so-called linear ramp. But in general, the necessary width of such ramps would have meant that they were rarely used. The staircase ramp, a narrow set of steps leading up one face of the pyramid, would have been set at a steeper angle than the others. traces of this type have been found at Sinku, Meedum, Giza, Abu Ghraib and Lisht. The principal objection to the spiral ramp, perhaps described in the 19th century dynasty papyrus Anastasi first, is the question of what it would have rested on and how corrective calculations and checks could have been made from the corners if most of the pyramid was covered up. The reversing ramp, a zigzag course up one face of a pyramid, would probably have been most effective for the construction of step pyramids, although frustratingly there are no signs of its use on the step pyramids at Saqqara, Sinki and Meidum. So traces of interior ramps have survived inside the remains of the pyramids of Sau, Niasir and Neferkare at Abusir and Pepidu at Saqqara, but some kind of exterior ramp was still needed after the interior was filled in. So it suggested that the terrace nature of the pyramid core would have often made it more convenient to use a series of much smaller ramps built along the sides of the pyramid from step to step. The remains of these would no doubt have been lost when the outer casing was applied. It's also possible that the causeway stretching from the pyramid to Valley Temple might have originally served as builders' ramps from key to construction site, connected to the Nile by canal. Apart from the question of the types of ramps employed, debate has also tended to centre on the methods by which individual stone blocks were raised into positions. Since the Egyptians made no use of block and tackle methods or cranes, it's usually assumed that the wooden and copper levers were used to manoeuvre the blocks into position. One of the more distinctive icons of ancient Egyptian civilization was the obelisk, a tapering needle-like stone monument, the tip of which was carved into the form of a miniature pyramid, also known as a pyramidion or benben stone. So the first obelisks seem to have been erected in the temple of the sun god at Heliopolis during the Old Kingdom. By the New Kingdom, large monolithic examples, usually of granite or quartzite, were often erected in pairs in front of temples such as those at Karnak and Luxor, and an unfinished granite obelisk, probably dating to the New Kingdom, still lies in the northern quarries at Aswan. Here it is. So a major geological flaw altered work on it. This probably could have been the largest obelisk ever quarried. So it had a length of 137 feet and a planned weight of around 1,150 tons. It would have been the largest one ever cut if it wasn't abandoned at a fairly late stage in the quarrying process when a disastrous flaw appeared. So experiments by Reginald Engelbach, the British Egyptologist who first studied the Aswan obelisk, showed that it would have taken one person an hour to remove 0.2 inches of stone from a strip 1 foot 8 inches wide across the obelisk using a bolzol pounder. So the very large size and weight of most obelisks means that the final stage, the raising of it into a stable vertical position, was one of the most ambitious and dangerous of the technological achievements mastered by Egyptians. Opinions of Egyptologists and engineers vary considerably as to how this was achieved. In the absence of any Egyptian information, one suggestion is that levers were used to be used in combination with stones packed under the base and pull with ropes the obelisk the last few degrees into a vertical position, but that would have only really been feasible with relatively small examples, because as far as larger obelisks were concerned, one suggestion was that the monument was slid gradually over a very steep artificial embankment, although this method would have required an almost impossible control over the huge mass of stone as it made its descent towards the pedestal. So each pedestal had a turning groove cut into it so the obelisk could be correctly aligned before being raised into position. So Engelbach suggested that the obelisk could have been slid down into a funnel-shaped pit made of sand. The idea was that the sand was then allowed to drain away out of the pit in such a careful way that the obelisk would have gradually settled into the correct vertical position. So the inspiration for that theory was provided by the above-mentioned 19th dynasty papyrus Anastasi first, which takes the form of a problem to be solved by a scribal people. The document includes the command, empty the magazine that has been loaded with sand under the monument of your lord, which has been brought from the Red Mountain, with 100 chambers filled with sand from the riverbank. So here's the reconstruction of the swagging method of erecting an obelisk, attempted by a multinational team of archaeologists and engineers near the granite quarries at Aswan in Egypt. So two different methods were attempted by a team in using a 25-ton freshly quarried obelisk. So the first attempt conducted as one was the so-called swigging method, where a complex set of ropes and timber beams were used to lower the obelisk gradually over the edge of an embankment using a large log as a pivot and a granite block a counterweight. That failed because the rocking action of the obelisk slowly moved the pivot dangerously close to the edge of the embankment. An experimental version of Engelbach's sandpit theory, conducted near Boston, Massachusetts, was successful, though. In that method, a concrete enclosure filled with sand was built in front of an embankment, and an obelisk was tipped over the edge of the embankment, and the sand was then gradually moved, causing the monument to descend gradually into a vertical position. So the moving and raising of obelisks was a major feat of organisation, a task that has presented difficulties even to those that have attempted it in the 19th and 20th centuries AD, when obelisks were successfully re-erected in London, Paris and New York. Here's a very famous riddle, the riddle of the Sphinx. Of course, here we have the riddle posed by the Sphinx to Oedipus. A thing with one voice but four, then two, then 3 feet. Nothing more changeable than this thing to be found in earth or sky or sea. When this thing goes on most feet, then its strength is at its weakest and its pace most slow. So of course the riddle most commonly associated with the Sphinx is the one solved by Oedipus in Greek legend, but more than one riddle, however, surrounds the Great Sphinx next to the pyramids at Giza, which was the distant ancestor of the malevolent Greek Sphinx. When was it made? Who made it? And for whom? Are there any secret chambers inside it or below it? So first of all, what's a Sphinx? The ancient Greeks thought that the word Sphinx came from a Greek word meaning to strangle, but it seems likely that its real origin is the Egyptian phrase sheseb-ankh, living image, which is an epithet applied to sculpture and occasionally to the Great Sphinx itself. So in Egypt they usually portrayed with the body of a lion, identified with the sun god, and the head of a man, often wearing royal headgear, such as the nemes cloth. It's assumed that the combination of lion and man was intended to symbolise the union of the king with the sun god Re. And one major difference between the Egyptian sphinxes and their Greek counterparts was that the earliest Egyptian versions were always male, until the Middle Kingdom, when the first winged sphinxes were also began to be depicted. So the Great Sphinx, located beside the causeway of the ancient pyramid of Khafre, measures nearly 238 foot long and a maximum of 66 foot in height. Carved from a knoll of rock left behind after quarrying over centuries, it was almost completely buried by sand, though it has often been repeatedly recleared. An incomplete temple, apparently made from the same stone as the Sphinx itself, was built immediately next to it. So this is the statue of Khafre from his valley temple at Giza. So it's likely that this is the pharaoh responsible for creating the Sphinx, because the head of which was probably carved in his image. Here's the plan of Giza, showing the location of the Sphinx next to the valley temple of Khafre's pyramid. On the right here is the dream stela between the poles of the Sphinx, and below the variation and erosion of different parts of it has been shown due to the various geological layers that it was carved from. So the temple was probably intended for the worship of the 3 forms of the sun: Khepri in the morning, Re at midday, and Atum in the evening, a scenario which intriguingly parallels the 3 ages of humans in the Greek riddle of the Sphinx quoted above. In the New Kingdom, the Sphinx was identified with Hofmakat, Horus in the horizon, perhaps inspired by the fact that the buried Sphinx simply appeared to be the head of a colossal ruler emerging from the horizon. The most famous instance of reclearance was recorded on the Dream Stela, erected directly in front of the Sphinx by Thutmose IV, around 1400 BC. So the inscription describes the promise made to the young prince in a dream that if he rescued the Sphinx from the sand covering it, he would become the next king. As early as the 18th dynasty, 1550 to 1307 BC, the Sphinx was already being reconstructed using limestone cladding, and at this date, a standing royal statue was added between its paws. In recent years, there has been a growing concern about the gradual deterioration of the monument, which lost its nose a century years ago. Fragments of its missing beard and uraeus were excavated by Giovanni Battista Caviglia and later excavated excavated, and these are now in the British Museum and the Egyptian Museum, Cairo. More recently, erosion and rising groundwater have become a problem. So since the Sphinx is surrounded by the 4th dynasty royal pyramid complexes and mastaba tombs of royal officials, it's usually assumed that it was built at roughly the same time. In 1853, Auguste Mariette's excavation at the nearby Valley Temple of the 4th dynasty ruler Khafre suggested that this pharaoh was the likely creator of the monument, and that the Sphinx head was probably carved in his image. The inscription of the 18th dynasty dream stela includes a possible fragmentary reference to Khafre. Certainly the various features of the head of the Sphinx, its nemes headcloth, its uraeus, and its general physiognomy are comparable with the royal statues of the 4th dynasty. But this apparently convincing archaeological and art historical dating evidence was temporarily shaken in 1992 when an American geologist, Robert Schoch, claimed to have found evidence showing that the rock of the Sphinx and its surrounding enclosure had been severely eroded by rainwater runoff at least 2,500 years earlier than the 4th dynasty. He argued first that this distinctive erosion had taken place only after the Sphinx's body had been carved, secondly that the high water levels of rainfall necessary to create such weathering could only have occurred in the Neolithic period between 7,000 and 5,000 BC, and thirdly that the monument and its temple had been built in 2 stages, the first being the carving of the core, and the second the provision of casing blocks on the exterior. He explained that the much later art historical dating of the head by suggesting that it might have been carved or recarved by a 4th dynasty ruler. So support for the conventional Egyptological dating of the Sphinx came from another American geologist, James Harrell, who suggested that the erosion might instead have been caused from covering of saturated sand or floodwaters from the Nile. Harrell also argued that the nature of the topography of the plateau would have caused rainwater to drain down towards the Sphinx, so that the levels of rainfall in the Old Kingdom might in fact have been sufficient to produce the weathering observed by Schoch, particularly if the rainwater saturated the sand surrounding it. The archaeologist Mark Lehner, who directed a painstaking photosymmetric survey of the Sphinx in the 1980s, refuted a number of Schoch's arguments, including the suggestion of a 2-stage process of the construction for the Sphinx and temples, which he points out were totally contrary to the known building methods employed by ancient Egyptians. Here's a computer reconstruction of the Sphinx of the New Kingdom royal statue standing between its paws. And here is the Sphinx, still mostly buried in the sand, as depicted in a lithograph by the artists of Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in the late 18th century. Can you imagine discovering that just sticking out of the sand? Just an incredible, mind-blowing discovery. Here's the Sphinx in classical style, as imagined by the 17th century Jesuit Athanasius Kircher, who never actually visited Egypt. A large stone block destined for the unfinished Sphinx temple was found immediately above a stratigraphic layer containing 4th dynasty pottery, and then finally Lehner argued that the unusually high numbers of large-scale statues excavated from Khafre's pyramid complex make it even more likely that he was the creator of the Sphinx. Are there any secret chambers in it? Tales from the Middle Ages onwards used to be told about secret chambers under the Sphinx. 2 Arab writers, Al-Makrizi and Al-Khaldai, described a chamber beneath the Sphinx from which 3 passages extended, leading to one of the 3 pyramids. Stories of this kind were taken up by early European travellers such as Johannes Helfferich in 1579, who described a tunnel leading up into the head, a result of which ancient priests were said to have convinced worshippers that the Sphinx could utter oracles. The reliability of this account, though, is put into perspective by his publication of a woodcut depicting the Sphinx with breasts, as if it were the Greek female version. Although the archaeological investigations of Caviglia, Gaston Maspero, Emil Barres, and Selim Hassan revealed no secret chambers under either the Sphinx or its temples. The association between the monument and a buried repository of secret knowledge was revived in the 1930s by Edgar Cayce, an American psychic. Cayce claimed that the wisdom of Atlantis had been placed in a subterranean hall of records associated with the Sphinx, and that its rediscovery during the 20th century would result in some huge disaster. Resistivity surveys in 1977 and 8 and 1992 to 3 revealed anomalies, fluctuations in electrical resistance, perhaps caused by cavities in the vicinity of the Sphinx, but subsequent work, including the use of magnetic surveys, showed that these anomalies were natural fissures and cavities. Mark Lehner's study of the Sphinx resulted in a much improved understanding of the various phases of construction and ancient and modern restoration of the monument, and has determined that there are 3 passages associated with the Sphinx. One is a small shaft, which is known to have been drilled directly into the top of the neck, immediately behind the head by Colonel Richard Weiss in the mid-19th century. The 2 others are of unknown date and do not appear to have contained any artifacts or inscriptions. So the current evidence suggests that the Sphinx was neither a precocious Neolithic monument nor an Atlantean filing cabinet, but until we know precisely why it was sculpted and why we can find no obvious mention of it in Old Kingdom records, there will continue to be an aura of mystery around this most colossal of Egyptian statues. Where was the land of Punt? Somalia, Sudan, Ethiopia, 2,450 to 1,170 years ago. Here is a stela in the mortuary temple of Amenhotep III. Turning my face to sunrise, I created a wonder for you. I made the lands of Punt come here to you, with all the fragrant flowers of their lands, to beg your peace and breathe the air you give. For at least 1,300 years from the reign of King Soho until the time of Ramses III, the ancient Egyptians periodically sent trading expeditions to a region they knew as Punt. So it's clear that Punt lay somewhere towards the south of Egypt. Modern scholars long argued over its precise location. So evidence for the nature of the land of Punt and its inhabitants consists of a mixture of textual and pictorial information. The painted scenes and inscriptions indicate that these traders were sent there to obtain such exotic products as gold, aromatic resins, fine woods, ivory, and wild animals such as giraffes, monkeys, baboons. Scenes in certain New Kingdom temples and tombs depict the inhabitants of Punt as a people with a dark reddish complexion and fine features, shown with long hair in the earlier paintings, but from the late 18th dynasty onwards they were portrayed with a more close-cropped hairstyle. The location of Punt was once identified with the region of modern Somalia, but a strong argument is now made for its location in either southern Sudan or the Eritrean region of Ethiopia, where the indigenous plants and animals equate most closely with those depicted in the reliefs and paintings. Here are the reliefs here, showing Parahu, the ruler of Punt, and Nati, his wife, and the saddle donkey that carried her. It was still relatively unusual for Egyptians to ride donkeys or horses at this time. So a particularly elaborate set of scenes in the cult temple of Queen Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari was perhaps painted to commemorate the resumption of trade in contact with Punt after a long period of inactivity. These depictions include very distinctive Puntite settlements with conical reed built huts built on poles above the ground, entered via ladders. And here is a modern-day Dinka village in Sudan with houses raised on stilts very similar to the houses of the Puntites as depicted on the reliefs at this temple. The ruler of Punt, distinguishable from the Egyptians primarily by his long beard and unusual costume, is seen emerging from the settlement to greet the Egyptian trading party, and the ruler's name is given as Parahu, and it's implied that he's the sole leader of the Puntites. However, many other inscriptions suggest that the Egyptians encountered several different groups in Punt, each with their own leader, in the same way that the peoples of Lower and Upper Nubia were divided into various named tribes. It is possible that Parahu was the ruler of a loose confederation of chiefdoms, or the representation of a coastal group acting as middlemen between the Egyptians and the more inland regions of Punt. Here are images depicting what these reliefs would have been in this temple. So it's usually been assumed that trading parties travelled from Thebes to Punt via 2 stages. First on foot across the eastern desert, and then by boat down the Red Sea coast, probably embarking in the ports of Qusr or Mersa Oasis. And although the Deir el-Bahari images confirm the arrival and departure of at least one major Punt expedition by boat via the Red Sea, the fish in the waters around Hatshepsut's feet are marine species rather than riverine. It seems possible that some contacts might have been made trade by sailing south up the Nile to the Fourth Cataract, then either trading with the Pundites in the vicinity of the fortress at Kirgis, or taking an overland route direct to Punt itself. The argument for the combined Nile and overland route as opposed to the Red Sea voyage has been suggested by an American Egyptologist, Louise Bradbury. She points out that the scenes in the 18th dynasty tomb of Min, chief treasurer in the reigns of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II, show him overseeing a trading encounter with the Pundites, who are apparently arriving in flat rafts more suited to river transport than the rigours of the Red Sea. She also argues that the lack of New Kingdom inscriptions in the eastern part of the Wadi Hammamat make it less likely that this overland Red Sea route was frequently used at this date. Even after Punt had become firmly established as a trading partner, it's continued to be regarded as a kind of distant Shangri-La. In the Middle Kingdom story of the shipwrecked sailor, the eponymous hero encounters a magic serpent supplying myrrh and describing himself as the King of Punt. And after the end of the New Kingdom, however, Punt is rarely mentioned in Egyptian records. The last surviving reference to the region occurs on a fragmentary 26th dynasty stela around 600 BC, and even here the emphasis has shifted from trade to climate, with an intriguing description of Punt as a mountainous area where high rainfall could affect the height of the Nile flood down in Egypt. No, I didn't even know Punt was a thing, and now we do. Was Tutankhamun murdered? My husband is dead and I have no son, I am afraid. Tutankhamun, Queen of Egypt, widow of Tutankhamun, 1323 BC. The discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun by Howard Carter in 1922 dazzled the world. Its 4 chambers contained over 2,000 objects that revealed the incredible wealth of the pharaoh at the zenith of Egypt's ancient power. Among the most awe-inspiring was the king's innermost coffin, made of 10 kilograms of solid gold, and within it was the kernel of the tomb, the mummy of the king himself. Although in very poor condition, the body provided one of the key facts about the king, that he had died at a tender age of no more than 20 years. The first autopsy was carried out by Dr. Douglas Derry in 1925, shortly after the coffins were opened. He noted a lesion on the left cheek, a rounded depression, the skin filling it resembling a scab. Round the circumference of the depression, which had slightly raised edges, the skin was discoloured. He was unable to express any opinion as to the cause of death. X-rays taken in 1968 by Professor R.G. Harrison allowed tuberculosis to be ruled out. A shot of the skull showed a stray fragment of bone within, which a defect which might indicate a hemorrhage, conceivably caused by a blow to the head. The X-rays also revealed that the front of the ribcage was missing, presumably moved during the embalming process. So it's been suggested that the king might have suffered a catastrophic chest injury that could only be cleaned up for burial by radical post-mortem surgery. However, there are no signs of other injuries, and it could be simply another unexplained variation of the standard embalming process that turns up every so often in the archaeological record. Thus, there is no unequivocal physical evidence of the case of Tutankhamun's death. However, many suspected that foul play might have been involved, particularly in view of the circumstantial evidence provided by events both before and after the young king's death. Of course, one of the treasures from the greatest treasures from the tomb is the boy king's second gilded wood coffin. It was originally made for another king, but like a large number of other objects found in the tomb, it had been appropriated for his burial equipment. The mummy, the body has a number of unusual features, including a missing part of the ribcage, linked with the position of the arms laid over the stomach area. In other royal mummies of the period, they're crossed over the chest. Below left here is A performing the funeral rites of Tutankhamun as shown on the wall of the latter's burial chamber, and under Egyptian law, carrying out a person's burial confirmed one's status as heir. So it was common in private tombs, such as a scene like this is not otherwise found in a royal sepulchre, may indicate that heirs needed to emphasise legitimacy in the wake of the events surrounding Tutankhamun's death. And here is Queen Ankhesenem, the third daughter of Akhenaten and wife of Tutankhamun. After her husband's death, having borne only 2 stillborn daughters, she wrote to the king of the Hittites was the successor and probably the son of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, who had abolished the traditional polytheistic religion of Egypt in favour of a single sun god of the Aten. Even while Akhenaten was still alive, they had apparently been moved back towards the ancient cults, and with the pharaoh's death, the forces of counter-reformation gained in power. So as a child of no more than 10, Tutankhamun was under the protection of high officials, notably a group of army generals headed by A and Horemheb, the latter holding the title of King's Deputy. A was possibly the father of Nefertiti, who was the wife of Akhenaten and the mother of Tutankhamun's wife, Ankhesenamun. Under the general's direction, the king had officially returned to the traditional religion and undertaken a major temple restoration program. But by the time he reached his late teens, Tutankhamun would have been in a position to make his own decision, which may or may not have coincided with the views of his advisors. The fact that the king was dead within a short time of attaining adulthood has been regarded as suspicious. The fact that his successor was none other than the General I, his erstwhile advisor, has also been entered into the equation. There's a remarkable correspondence between Queen Ankhesenamun and the king of the Hittites, an empire roughly corresponding to modern Turkey, where the queen states that her husband's dead and that she's unwilling to marry one of her subjects and make him king, so she wishes to marry a Hittite prince instead, and that she's afraid. Many have assumed that the subject in mind is a Hittite prince was sent but was killed en route to Egypt. I duly became king, seemingly having married Ankhesenamun, who disappeared shortly afterwards. So this could be interpreted as more skullduggery by I. It should be noted that Ankhesenamun's offer of the Egyptian throne to a foreigner would have been tantamount to treason, and if Tutankhamun was murdered, Ankhesenamun could be suggested as the culprit, plotting to rule thereafter through a foreign husband backed by Hittite military power. Such as an alternative scenario far from casting I a villain, would make him the defender of Egypt's liberty against a criminal, scheming queen. However, it must be emphasised that no examination of the body revealed conclusive evidence as to the cause of death, and that all such scenarios are merely potential interpretations of extremely sketchy evidence. All that can be said with certainty is that Tutankhamun died young. Murder is certainly a possibility, but so are a range of alternatives. As far as violent death is concerned, blocks from a now demolished temple strongly suggest that Tutankhamun may have taken part in military campaigns despite his tender years. Could he have died in battle? And the possibility that his death was merely accidental or natural cannot, on the available evidence, be ruled out. It is quite probable that we will never know. Here is Dr. Derry making the first incision into the wrappings of Tutankhamun. What a discovery! And an X-ray of the skull, taken in 1968, shows a stray fragment of bone, as well as evidence of perhaps a hemorrhage caused by a blow to the head. And that concludes this part of the 70 mysteries of the ancient world. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to having you join me next time. Until then, goodbye.